outside of media and in media are intricately intertwined, and that they have consequences for each other. That whatever we talk about, whatever link we click on, whatever message we send or choose to open, has real consequences for real human beings' lives, including our own. And so that was a kind of an eye-opening moment for me. I mean, it's something that informs most of our theories and methods in media mass communication works. A very simple idea, namely that media matter, right? That it matters what we see on TV, that it matters what we read in a book or in a magazine, that it matters how we exchange information on WhatsApp or any of the other applications that we use on our smartphones and on our computers. That all of that truly makes a difference. However, when we try to explain that to our colleagues elsewhere, and especially to the people in the streets, they go either like, well, yeah, that's common sense, and why would you, that's, or they would say, well, that's nice, but there's something like the real world where real human beings try to, survive on a day-to-day basis. So your stuff about phones and movies and books is a bit irrelevant, or a bit, it's a sideshow. But now we realize, and everybody on the planet realize, no, that's not true. So it's a very powerful moment. And I think when we look back on this period, as we are doing now and in this moment, but also in the years to come, I think that should be a key starting point to really take the time to reflect on the significance of this moment, of this realization that a pandemic and an infodemic are interdependent, simultaneous, mutually implicated phenomena, and that it is the most clear operationalization of the fundamental premise that informs every single thing that we do as students and scholars of media and mass communication. So, and in a way, that to me is a hopeful notion, right? It articulates our position in the university as well. I mean, it's been long my conviction that every single student at the university, regardless of their major or discipline or whatever, should take at least one media class, right? I mean, because you cannot function in the world today without understanding and appreciating the role that media play in it. Whether you are a doctor or a nurse, whether you are a politician, whether you're a business owner, whether you are, well, anybody. So that's my first point, this sort of call to stay mindful and reflective of this parallel pandemic, infodemic, I would almost say repertoire that have these concepts that have now been introduced in the way the world talks about Corona, that immediately bring to attention the important role that we play in helping people making sense of all of this. Now, my second point was related to, okay, we've got an infodemic and a pandemic. So what role do media actually play in all of this? Role that we play in helping people making sense of all of this. First and foremost, we have to address the notion of, now, my second concern that is implied or implicated in the use of the term infodemic. There's other terms. Infodemiology is another term that was introduced by the World Health Organization in September of this year. This notion that as we are called as citizens to flatten the curve of infection, right, by wearing masks, by washing our hands, by keeping social distance, and all those kind of measures that would limit the spread of the virus. The same goes for the way we spread information. Like when we share a link, when we share a story, when we share a bit of information about anything related to Corona, have we checked and double-checked its source? Have we thought about whether this information contributes to informing people and helping people cope, or does it just make people more scared or afraid? In other words, we have some mediated washing of our hands to do. We have some mediated mask wearing to do in order to take responsibility for our role in the pandemic. And this concept of infodemiology is, I think, really interesting because it speaks to, on the one hand, acknowledgement that the main role that media play in a corona context is not one of institutions informing people, it's of people informing people. Right? There's this massive shift that, of course, all of us have been documenting for the last 20 years or so, where the primacy of institutions has given way to the primacy of individuals, or more precisely, of networks. Right? Since the mid to late 1990s, we're all familiar with theories of the network society by Jan van Dijk or Manuel Castells and many others. And we see this now in action, right? Is that the key concern is not how CNN is informing Americans. It's how anybody shares information and gets information anywhere. So it is interesting that this comes with two very powerful ways of explaining this. On the one hand, a sort of exciting democratic potential of media, right? It's like we are all participating in building our own reality or in media. I mean, we all play a role. It's not exclusive to powerful agents and institutions anymore. So there's a true participatory notion in all of this. And on the other hand, an incredibly deep-seated fear that, well, when you give people control over their own media environment, they will all end up in filter bubbles, echo chambers. They will only spread lies and misinformation. There will be a rise of online hatred and fear-mongering. And so it's almost frustrating for me as a media scholar to stand on the sidelines and see this debate unfolding. I mean, the first lesson that Dennis McQuail taught us, I mean, the opening chapter of the book is that in order to understand and appreciate the role of media mass communication, we have to move beyond utopian or dystopian discourses, right? Media don't make the world a better place. Media don't turn the world into a global dystopian nightmare. Media play an incredibly complicated and nuanced role. And if anything, what they do primarily is to amplify and accelerate what's already there. So, but it is important to recognize this notion of the infodemic and infodemiology and the assumptions that this brings about the role that media play in everyday life. A second, I think, key observation about the role that media play in the corona context is it's a concept that we know from our literature, but now everybody talks about it. It's the notion of, I think Sonia Livingstone said it first when she was president of the International Communication Association a couple of years ago. She said, well, I mean, we have to talk about the mediation of everything. Now, one thing to say that media play a role in every aspect of our lives, in the way we form and maintain friendships, in the way we find Livingstone and keep jobs, first when she was president, we structure our International Communication Association a couple of years ago. She said, well, we have to talk about the mediation of everything. Every single part of our life is touched by media. One thing to say that media play a role in every aspect of our lives, in the way we form and maintain friendships, sort of, in the way we find Livingstone's job first when she was president, we structure our International Communication Association a couple of years ago. She said, well, we have to talk about the mediation of every single part of our life is touched by media. One thing to say that media play a role in every aspect of our lives, in the way we form and maintain friendships, sort of, in the way we find Livingstone's job first when she was president, we structure our International Communication Association a couple of years ago. Said, well, we have to talk about the mediation of every single part of our life is touched by media. One thing to say that media play a role in every aspect of our lives, in the way we form and maintain friendships, sort of, in the way we find Livingstone's job first when she was president, we structure our International Communication Association a couple of years ago. Said, well, we have to talk about the mediation of every single part of our life is touched by media. One thing to say that media play a role in every aspect of our lives, in the way we form and maintain friendships, sort of,
in the way we find living jobs, when you the way we structure our Education Association, the way we use politics as well. We have to talk about the mediation of every single part of our life. Is one thing to say that media playing a role in every aspect of our life. The way we form and maintain friendships, in the way we find living jobs, when you the way we structure our Education Association, the way we use politics as well. We have to talk about the mediation of every single part of our life. Is one thing to say that media playing a role in every aspect of our life. The way we form and maintain friendships, in the way we find living jobs, when you the way we structure our Education Association, the way we use politics as well. We have to talk about the mediation of every single part of our life. Is one thing to say that media playing a role in every aspect of our life. The way we form and maintain friendships, in the way we find living jobs, when you the way we structure our Education Association, the way we use politics as well. We have to talk about the mediation of every single part of our life. Is one thing to say that media playing a role in every aspect of our life. The way we form and maintain friendships, in the way we find living jobs, when you the way we structure our Education Association, the way we use politics as well.
Like in the Netherlands, for example, the big story this summer in the news was that every single outdoor toy was sold out. From bicycles to trampolines to like blow up swimming pools to now I know this is news from a very rich and privileged society. However, it is interesting is that a primary response that people have when they are truly locked into their devices is to try to get away from them. Before COVID and Corona, it would be perfectly normal that people would love to spend all their time on their devices. And now when they have to, they all want to go outside. So it is clear that our relationship with our media is ambivalent, right? It is affective, right? Meaning that it's emotional. Our relationship with our technologies and what we do with our media is incredibly emotional. It's very personal. We take it personal. But as all relationships are, they're also ambivalent. Like sometimes we just want to run away from them, and sometimes we just had enough. It's like, you know, when you think about your relationship with your partner or with your kids, I mean, of course you love them, right? But sometimes you just want to be left alone. Well, that's our relationship with media as well. And I think this year has really made that clear to everybody, and not just to media scholars. But it should be, as media scholars, on the top of our minds when we do research in this area. A third comment I would like to make about the role of media and ICTs in the pandemic is specifically the role of media industries. And I mean, and the reason I'm doing that is also because that's often my primary object of research, right? Is how people inside media industries make it work, how they remain creative, how they remain dedicated to their ideals and motivations, and while also having to make ends meet. And one thing that we saw this year amplified and accelerated, it's a trend that we've seen for the last 10, 15 years, is that while media industries enjoy larger audiences than ever before in history, they are also earning less income, right? I mean, what has happened, I'm sure the reports have been similar in India, is that the only companies who truly got rich this year were the platform companies, the Apples and Googles and Facebooks and those kind of companies. They just, their stock value boomed, whereas the value of media organizations just plummeted. And to a large extent, this was caused by their dependency on advertising revenue. Right, advertisers, and they've been doing this for the last 10, 15 years, but this year this trend has accelerated, have completely redirected their investments to online. And the primary reason for that is the absence of live events or must-see television. But in a more broader observation, I would say that this year has become very clear that media industries in general and journalism in particular cannot survive on the basis of advertising. And there is no future there at all. And so we have to this entire industry has to completely rethink the way it makes money and pays its bills. And this is especially frustrating if you're a media professional, because you're working in an industry that has larger audiences than ever before. It's just that nobody pays, they don't pay you, they pay the people through whom they get access to you. In other words, platforms. So that's I think a really fascinating, if somewhat troubling, development here as well, is the growth of media industries in every way except revenue, in terms of revenue. So that's a unique situation. So whenever we do our research and we make all kinds of claims about, for example, what journalism should be like or do, or how the advertising industry or the film industry is doing things right or wrong, just be mindful that you're talking about an industry that's dying financially. I mean, in terms of content, it's not. I think the kind of journalism that we've seen this year has been nothing but astounding. I think it's the incredible work that journalists under impossible circumstances are doing. It's clearly not enough, and that is that forces us to rethink, I think, the role of industries in all of this. So my third point today. So I started with the point about infodemic and pandemic, sort of how that. How those terms have been introduced in our lexicon this year. My second point were a couple of key observations about the role of the media in the pandemic. My third point is of what have we learned up until now. And I want to say again, I apologize if I repeat myself, how difficult it is to make sense of any of this as we're still in the middle of it, right? So please take my comments with a grain of salt. I'm sure none of what I say is new to any of you. I mean, we're all in the middle of this, but perhaps it's somewhat helpful to have it sort of to jointly summarize kind of what we're all seeing and experiencing. So what conclusions, if any, can we draw at the moment? I think three of them are particularly important to me. And again, none of this is particularly new or groundbreaking in any sense of the word. I won't claim that. But there are things that are, I think, inspiring to me in this context. The first and foremost is something I've already mentioned. It's the seeming return of powerful media theories. Right? It seems that when governments make all kinds of decisions about the spread of information, about the implementation of media technology, for example, in health, like releasing a coronavirus app and investigating health applications that work at a distance in like monitoring tools, digital monitoring tools in intensive care units, so doctors can be freed up to do work elsewhere in the hospital. And I mean, the list is endless about decisions that are being made about media and media technologies. And they all seem to be based on an assumption that media are incredibly powerful. That when you use media for something, that something will change and something will happen. Now, we, as we're gathered here today, all know that that's not really the case. Right? Media aren't that incredibly powerful. And even if they are powerful, that power is often it goes into different directions. As Dennis McQuill taught us, media have effects, but those effects can be intended, but also unintended. They can be positive, but also negative. They can happen right now, or they can happen over time. There is so much to say about media effects and the power of media. Primarily, we can say about them that, well, yeah, media can play a pretty powerful role in what people think about. They have somewhat in a role of how people make sense of things, but directly influencing behavior, we don't have a whole lot of evidence for that. If anything, we have evidence that media under some circumstances have some effects for some people, right? And all serious media effects research comes to the conclusion that we can really only say things about media effects on an individual basis. There is no general theory of media effects that explains their role in everything. So we know all of that. I'm summarizing the basic insights of media effects research. So I'm not saying that media don't have effects. Media have enormous effects. It's just that those effects are complicated, right? And that's our job, to disentangle that and try to see when, where, how, under what circumstances, and be precise and specific, using multiple methods, studying things over time. Right? That's kind of, in a nutshell, how far we've come in our research in the last 100 years or so. However, the rest of the world this year seems to have embarked on an entirely different trajectory, utterly and completely convinced that media are all powerful. It almost seems we're back at the hypodermic needle theory of the media, right? That when people see something in an app or on Reddit or by looking at Google, it goes directly into their veins, and that's what they believe. And it's frustrating to see that, but it's also an opportunity to have that discussion, not just with our colleagues, but with our societies. It's like, okay, but what's really going on? If it's not that, then what is it? Which leads me to a second observation, is that I think in our field, as I've also tried to describe in a new edition of Dennis McQuail's handbook when I started, because of course the last one appeared 10 years ago, and quite a lot has changed in 10 years in our media environment. And some theories that have been developed in the last 10 years specifically about the role of media in society, I would argue have now come full circle. They have become reality, if you will. Theories like mediatization, or from anthropology, we have theories about polymedia. And there's numerous other theories. As some of you may know, I've contributed to this field with my own sort of perspective called media life. What is important is that what all these theories have in common is that they recognize two things at the same time. On the one hand, they say, the media as an industry and as a technology play an important role in society. Is that you can see that society is orienting itself increasingly through media. People, as well as institutions, develop all kinds of routines and rituals that are specifically targeting or focused on how they use media in order to make things work in their lives. Like, we all have tactics and strategies for maintaining our social media profiles and what pictures we put up there. And I mean, it's hard not to, when you're in a restaurant and your meal looks particularly yummy, not to think of how to make a good picture of it so you can post it to your feed. I mean, those are tiny little examples of this point that I'm making. So that's one part of these theories, right? And the other, I guess, part of these theories is that there is no outside to media anymore, which is a much more fundamental point, I guess. And that relates back to, of course, what I started out with today, this notion of an infodemic and pandemic being parallel or mutually implicated or interdependent concepts. That there is no way of talking and making sense of anything in life and society that does not involve media, one way or another, directly or indirectly, now or in the past or in the future. And what is the significance of that insight? I think is that it really messes with all the basic models of media mass communication that we think about: sender, message, receiver. Right? One of the most fundamental transmission-based models of communication. Well, how does that work when those roles are not separate anymore, when they're all mutually implicated? We know from cultural studies some attempts to accommodate this, the circuit of culture, encoding, decoding. We have lots of concepts in our field to help us with that. But all of these concepts come from a time before this sort of mutual implication of society, life, and media, where they cannot be disentangled anymore, which really, truly necessitates a fundamental rethink. I mean, I've just had a meeting last week with the publisher, Sage, to talk about work on the 8th edition of McQuill. In 5 years' time, there will be an 8th edition, I hope. And yeah, the realization is I'll have to rewrite the entire book. Not that throwing away what we already know, but to fundamentally rethink everything we know in our field in this new environment. So where all our categories of making sense of media mass communication still there, but they're floating, they're mutually implicated, they're dynamic. And what are the consequences of that for our methods, for our operationalization, for the different kinds of studies and the kind of claims that we can make? I think this will become a fundamental challenge in our field. It already is. A third and final point here is something I've also alluded to earlier in my talk today, is this a recognition of the incredibly emotional, personal, intimate relationship that we have with our media and how that shapes anything we do with media and any role that media play in life. I think we don't spend enough time recognizing this. We still, in our frameworks, in our theories, in our methods, sometimes seem to assume that media are devices and experiences that people sort of can switch on and off, where people can actually step away from and reflect on, that people can say meaningful things about. And I would argue that we can't. Media are so intensely personal and intimate to us, right? When Zizi Papakarisi in her work talks about affective publics, I think she makes she's one of the key scholars in our field who started making these points already 10 years ago, if not earlier, that what we learn from truly studying what people do with media, whether those people are politicians and leaders or the butcher around the corner or your friends or family members, is that our relationships with media are completely governed by our emotions. And because media have become so close to us. And that closeness, that intimacy is fundamental. My next book before the new edition of McQuill is called Media Love. And I'm currently doing the research for that. And that entire book is about this particular point, is to truly understand what happens to the way we make sense of media if we first and foremost recognize that the primary emotion with which we make sense of media is love. Love for our devices, love for the things we experience through our devices. And with love comes hate, right? We also really hate this, right? We complain, our signal sucks, and it's a small anecdotal example of a much broader phenomenon. Is the relationship with us with this is so fundamentally intimate. And our research and our theories don't do that intimacy justice. So I think that's my third overall point. Now, in conclusion, and then I'll shut up, and I appreciate your patience with letting me talk so long. In conclusion, I would return to the point the challenge that Dr. Dinesh Babu, who invited me, supplied me with, is like, how can we look forward? I mean, how can media contribute to our social cultural development and all of this? And as I suggested in the beginning, I think that's a discussion of responsibility, and that I'm a strong believer of shared responsibility. And in this, I think it's important to recognize is that what we have to, as scholars and students of media, I think whatever kind of study you do, whatever kind of paper you write, whatever kind of book project you're involved in, whatever kind of research you're engaged in, I think a really important part of that, and I'm not saying we're not doing this, but if you're not, I would call upon you to do this, is to take a step back and to first really carefully think about this question. What do I want from media? And not just rationally, but emotionally. What is your, and I use this word deliberately, desire? What would you love the world to be like? And what role do media play in that? Make that explicit. And that should inform your research. But it also should inform the kind of claims we make about what other people are supposed to be doing. Like if we, for example, say we want journalism to be better, like our local news organizations or our national television media or whatever, or Google, if we want to make a claim about what they should be doing differently, what they should be doing better, it's like, okay, great. Where does that desire come from? What do you assume will happen when they do this thing you want them to do? On the basis of what would that happen? What kind of evidence do you have for that? And of course, more fundamentally, why would you want that? What inspires your desire in this context? And what are you doing? Right? I mean, if you want the world to be a better place, which is, of course, look, media and mass communication research is an aspirational field of study. Meaning is that all our research questions are informed by a desire to make the world a better place, right? We are concerned about disinformation because we assume that if people get the right information, they will make better decisions and act more responsibly and help each other in a better way. That's why we care about disinformation. And that's why so much of the debate about disinformation is, to be fair, a bit nonsensical. Because we have no evidence that people, when given the right information, will do the right thing. No, people do whatever they feel like doing. And that's their good right? So maybe the problem is not information or disinformation. Maybe the problem is that we are not investing enough in a shared dialogue of what we want from this world. And in that dialogue, spend enough time and resources to give everybody a voice, to be inclusive, to be mindful and respectful of people seeing things extremely differently from ourselves. So I mean, and this is a small example of a larger point, right? The point again is before we do our research and ask our questions, is to think carefully what it is that we want and why we want this. What are our desires? It is a quote from a Chilean biologist, Humberto Maturana, that informs me in all of this. And he back in the early 90s, he said something, and I'm paraphrasing, like he was asked about, and this was a biologist, mind you, about, there was in an interview was about the relationship between technology and the human body and technology and humanity. And as technology became more and more powerful, there was a concern, where does technology end the humanity start? What are our key challenges? And his answer was, he says the key challenges of our time are not so much about humanity and technology. The key challenges is about our desires and how we're going to take responsibility for it, right? The reason why we develop all kinds of technologies is because we are hoping that these technologies will do something to the world, to make the world a better place. I mean, for all our criticism of Facebook, I know that deep down inside, the people who work at Facebook, including Mark Zuckerberg, are absolutely convinced that their product contributes to making the world a better place. Now, perhaps that has become impossible because it's also a multi-million-dollar company, right? And perhaps we have to learn that these two things can't go together. But what if they could? How would Facebook need to change in order to accommodate? How can Facebook truly take responsibility for its own desire to make the world a better place? So I keep coming back to that fundamental idea. Like, if we ask the question, how can media contribute to social cultural development? The first question we need to ask is, what do you want? What is your desire and how are you taking responsibility for it? And that goes for us as individuals, like when we are angry that people share, conspiracy theories or fake news or disinformation. That goes to institutions, when political leaders and officials communicate and how they come up with their communication policies. It goes for, well, journalists and how they do their work, all of that. It keeps coming back to, we do this on the basis of certain desires, but often we do not articulate those desires. And therefore, we just contributing to a lot of debates and discussions without really moving forward. And it's, again, this is not a big reveal or something like that. I truly realize that I'm not saying anything particularly new or all that exciting. But to me, this has consistently been a way that helps me ground my own contributions in this area and articulate, like, if I'm going to start a new project or a new book or a new whatever, it's like, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I need a new publication for my resume? Well, that's a very sad reason, right? I mean, I recognize that this is important for a lot of scholars, but even if you're a student and you're in a class, why do I write the paper about this topic? Well, I have to because my professor told me to. That's sad. Can I turn this into something that helps me take responsibility for what I want out of this world? So in that way, media can contribute. And like I said, although it's important to stay away from utopian and dystopian perspectives on media, I do really appreciate, Dinesh, your agenda for today, because it is a utopian agenda, right? It's how can media play a role? And the thing is, media play in a fabulous role. I think I'm a strong believer. I'm an optimist. And I do think media play an incredible role in bringing the world closer together, even though those same mechanisms drive the world further apart. If anything, what I truly appreciate is that the role of media in all of this allows us to do things like this, is to meet, even if it's just virtually, with people truly in different parts of the world and listen to each other and take some time out of our busy schedules and busy days. And I'm deeply grateful for that opportunity to both speak to you, but also very much to listen to any thoughts or comments or questions and observations you may have. That's my prepared remarks. If we have time for questions, that would be absolutely lovely.
Being an academician, it was very nice to have around 45 minutes. You've given a good lecture and good discussion with us, and now the floor is open for discussion. Scholars and students, you can raise the question.
Video. Yes, Professor. Myself, Hari Krishnan.
Thank you.
So I have a very, very small question. It's a doubt actually. So we had television, radio, print media, etc. in the past. Now we have the new media, social media. What do you think will be the future of mass media?
You mean technologically, or what the next big thing will be, or what do you think?
Right. I mean technologically.
Okay. Well, if you look at the history of media as technologies, to me, a couple of things as an historian jump out, and the most important one, I think, is that our media become increasingly, for lack of a better, invisible. And let me explain. Is that originally, when you look at the history of the telephone as a device, or at the television as a device, or the radio as a device, we all remember what these devices were. They were big, they were clunky, they were hard to operate. I mean, the first televisions and radios were disguised as pieces of furniture, and because people felt self-conscious about having them in their living rooms, and then later on they became bigger and bigger and bigger and started occupying massive places in our homes. the telephone was this big clunky device that you had to put your finger in to dial a number, and it could only be in a certain part of the home. And now, of course, this is the phone, and you don't even see keys on it anymore or numbers, and most of us don't even use this to make phone calls. So what I'm trying to say is, what is the television today? I mean, a television it's a massive screen somewhere in your home. It's your computer. It's a tablet that you take everywhere you go. The television as a discrete device has disappeared. The phone as a particular instrument has almost disappeared. It has converged with other technologies. It has become part of a range of technologies that can be anywhere. And I think if you then, as an historian, would look forward, you can only say, well, that we're going to have more of that. In other words, we're going to have more access to different types of media technologies, whether it's something to read, something to watch, something to listen to, something to interact with, without those functionalities being part of particular devices. I remember when I was doing research for Media Life, this is 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, I looked at the field of architecture. And there's an entire area in the field of architecture that looks at merging building materials like cement and wood and stone, for example, with media technologies like silicone and those kind of things, and chips. And the idea behind that is, what if you can turn your entire home into a screen? And this was 10 years ago. Now, so what I'm trying to say with that is that my answer to your question would be that I can't tell you what the exact device of the future will be, but I can tell you that its properties and its functionality will be that we won't associate what we're doing with that particular device anymore. It will be, I mean, some people will call this ambient media, right? That media are sort of in our environment. And we already are beginning to get used to things like that. Think about motion sensing technology and voice-activated devices. And what these technologies have in common is that they make the link between us and a particular device increasingly intimate and intuitive and less specific. So rather than putting your finger in a dial or pressing a button on a remote, we just act in the world and our media activate around that. Now, that's the holy grail of computing as well, right? In the computing field, the holy grail is called ubiquitous computing, which is a term formulated originally in the 1980s, meaning computing that you're not aware that you're using. Right? I mean, I'm always reminded, I'm sorry if I go on too long, but I love these kind of stories, of the explanation why YouTube became so big, even though there were so many other video sharing platforms available at the time. And there's a very simple reason for that. I mean, there's a couple of reasons, but the one that appeals to me most in this particular context of your excellent question is, as we all now may know, is that when we watch a video online, to make the video work, we generally have to click on a little triangle, and that's the play button. Now, most of us, I'm sorry, I'm in my 50s. I don't know how old you are, but I would assume that a lot of us have grown up with technologies that had that kind of button in the home, like a cassette recorder or a VCR that had these sort of buttons with triangles on them and that said press play. So when video sharing websites started online, they often copied that, right? That's what new media are. New media are copies of old media. So you had an image of a video, and then underneath it was a little triangle, and we had to click on it and the video would play. That's how most video platforms started. Research at the time, I distinctly remember, I was living in the United States at the time. This was as from 2003. And I remember I was talking to one of the online editors of the New York Times. This was 2002 or 2003, yeah. And they just started putting videos on their website. And she told me, like, nobody ever clicks on these things, which is very frustrating because they put a lot of time and money to make these videos. And so they had some research, market research done, like, why are not people, is it bandwidth? Like, people don't have access to fast enough internet? Yes, that's part of the reason. But the most important reason is that people didn't know what button to click. So people didn't associate the little triangle with the play button. So more often they would see this image of this video and have no idea what to do, which we can't imagine, but that's the basic. So what did YouTube do differently? If you may remember, what YouTube did differently is they made the entire image a play button. So you only had to click anywhere on the image and the video would start. And it's that incredibly simple notion that immediately propelled them into, onto the world stage. Now, why do I tell you this story? Because to me, it's a story that in a nutshell exemplifies the whole history of media technology and what technology will probably be doing in the future, which is the more simple, intuitive, and without us having to use any kind of cognitive resources it is, the more likely that will be the kind of technology that all of us will be using in a couple of years from now. And all the technology and hardware and software manufacturers are moving into that direction. They've been doing this for the last 10, 15 years. If you watch the annual Consumer Electronics shows in Las Vegas, this is the trend. The trend is of media becoming more intimate, more intuitive, easier to use it. That means, but we don't have to use as many cognitive resources to figure media out. Like, we don't have to read user manuals. And media becoming everywhere, right? It's migrating from different platforms and devices. So we lose our loyalty to a specific device. And so that would be the future of media mass communication. And what this theoretically speaks to is the point that I made in my talk, which is this growing convergence of media and life, of that there's no outside to media anymore. Because if media are truly also technologically speaking everywhere, then we have to accommodate that in our theories and models. Now, I don't want to, let me conclude my answer, which is way too long, and I apologize, to your question. This is not an observation that is particular to, the rich urban centers or, where there's good connectivity and people are rich enough to afford all kinds of technologies. I mean, this development is truly global. And of course, it's unequal and not the same everywhere, and it's definitely not inclusive. And there's plenty of people who don't have fancy telephones and TVs and those kind of things. But I do think the trend overall going at, and it's not inevitable either. The inevitability, I guess, it has to do with media becoming more intuitive and ambient and ubiquitous and those kind of things. The challenge is that in that process, to make sure that we still find ways to stay aware of those media and make media, force media to stay inclusive, and give us a participating role in shaping the future of those media. I promise my future answers will be shorter. Sorry.
From that, one of the participants has a network issue. He wants to raise a question. What are your correlation between?
ആരോ ഒരു ചോദ്യം ചോദിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. The participants can also use the hand raise option if you have any questions, please.
Sir,
please.
Yeah, so I have a question. So you talked about shared responsibility, right? So I was wondering because you said it involved a lot of listening and answering. So I was wondering whether it's an ideal concept because wouldn't it lead to a lot of noise, generate a lot of noise?
That's a lovely question. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I actually wrote a piece, published a piece, I think it was last year or the year before, that's exactly about this, of like in a world where everybody's talking, who is listening, right? And it kind of seems that we're in that kind of world right now, where yes, everybody's participating in the conversation, but if we all are, then yes, then it's a lot of noise, and so I do think that it's not as simple. You're quite right. I mean, this is an ideal, typical call, as the call for shared responsibility and listening. But what it comes with is is two things. On the one hand, is knowing how to listen, which involves the principle of curation. It's to understand what is quality and what is not, and on the basis of which we make those kind of decisions. And this relates to so that's one part, and the other part is to be careful and about what we say when we speak, which is sort of to understand the craft of producing messages, content, if you will. Both those elements are, I think, are the fundamental elements of media literacy. And one thing that is really interesting is to monitor the global spread of media literacy programs or digital literacy programs. I mean, finally, we're seeing governments and other institutions, including schools all over the world, taking this seriously. And the real challenge in this, now that we're all implementing media literacy programs in schools and also adult learning programs regarding digital literacy, the challenge there is to make those literacy programs speak to these ideals. The ideal of the one hand is that, yes, when you use digital media, you are, whether you want to or not, producing stuff, data, content, messages. And that gives you a responsibility, right? You should know how to do that responsibly. You shouldn't. The best way to train people to avoid disinformation is to have them make in disinformation, right? Then they realize, oh, this is how that works. This is how much effort this and this is how I can check and validate the information that I send out. And at the same time, these literacy programs should address and acknowledge how difficult it is for us to listen effectively, and to help us develop, and in part to develop methods of dealing with information overload and those kind of things, but also to recognize how we're already throughout our lives, we've developed a sort of buffer against the information that comes at us from the world. And that buffer is partly shaped by our own cultural context and our upbringing. It is based on our biases and our beliefs. It has all kinds of variables and elements, and we have to be able to reflect on those, because then at least we can recognize why we choose certain sources over others, without even knowing how to evaluate these sources properly. So I've been involved in developing a media literacy program in the Netherlands for schools as an external expert, and I was always amazed that teachers who came up with these curricula never included issues of creativity and making in their curricula, sort of teaching kids how to make media rather than just to be skeptical and critical of the media. And on the other hand, how these programs were also always very much about button pushing, like knowing how to use specific technologies, rather than self-reflection, which is I need to know myself and how my filtering mechanisms work before I learn how to change the settings on Google, right? So it's I think those are real challenges in this context. Is to think creatively and critically about digital and media literacy, and to make sure that that includes, on the one hand, making literacy, and on the other hand, critical self-reflection and an awareness of our own biases and preferences. Not because they're necessarily wrong, it's just that they shape what choices we make in media and who to listen to and what information to share. And that's a real challenge. But I think that's a challenge that at least gives us something very concrete to do, also as media and communication scholars. I mean, it's again shocking how little media scholars are involved in developing media literacy programs. So these are often people from pedagogy and learning, or politicians and all kinds of institutional entities, good, willing, hardworking people. I'm not dismissing that, but they need us, and we should be publishing in their fields and engaging with those discussions, because we know things about media and how they work. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Harishankar, you may ask the question.
I have a bit of a lengthy question, sir.
Please.
So it's about Instagram, and my question is that right now we are living in a post-truth age with immersive and hyperreal media forms, which provide personalized experience to the user. For example, Instagram itself, and we can see that people are becoming more and more dependent on their mobile phones for information, entertainment, gratification, validation, etc. And also, due to this COVID situation, more and more people are being online because the internet has become cheaper, mobile phones have become cheaper, and more people are being online and consuming these social media platforms, which are hyper real and immersive. So I want to know, since more and more people are being online right now, this also gives the incentive to these platforms to provide more advertisements. And we are seeing that more and more people are being exposed to propaganda and advertisement on a much greater scale right now. I want to know how this is going to affect the society in the coming years.
This is an important, thank you for your question. This is an important global debate, right? And it's implied also in what I talked about earlier, this notion of a pandemic paralleled with an infodemic, the notion that a recognition that we're all living in media, that within that space, mobile media are a particularly potent force, and that we're all exposed to an incredible variety of information sources, most of which are not coming from vetted, venerable institutions, but from people like us. Excuse me. And that includes a lot of exposure to and a forwarding of information that isn't particularly useful or even truthful. So how does that impact the world? Well, I think for me, and this is my perspective, I know there's lots of different ways of making sense of this. First, we have to acknowledge that our concerns about this seem to be inspired these days by, like I said earlier, a return of all-powerful media effects theories. And we should be careful about that, because our discipline has spent the last 100 years debunking those theories. Right? I mean, when media mass communication research started in the 1920s in different parts of the world, the job that scholars had was to figure out the most effective way to communicate over the mass media of that time, which was radio and later on television, but specifically radio originally. And what researchers consistently found was, well, there is no real good way of doing that because media don't have that much effect on people. And basically ever since, we've been finding this, right? That there are simply just there's no good solid evidence for a theory of powerful media. And even the most recent studies about, for example, echo chambers and filter bubbers show that they don't really exist in the real world all that much. They certainly seem to, but if you actually study what people do with media, no. I mean, a filter bubble would only be a source of concern if somebody uses only one device, and on the device only using one app. Therefore, all his or her choices are governed by only one algorithm, and nobody does that. So I'm not saying we shouldn't care about filter bubbles or echo chambers or any of that. Of course we should. And technology is clearly evolving to become more and more intuitive and intimate, and therefore harder to control for us. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't care. I'm saying, first and foremost, the future of our world society in the context of global disinformation as we grow more dependent on media, and particularly mobile media, is not a dystopia. There's no evidence for that. However, what we can say is that and this is so important, and this is why, again, I keep hammering on how important to acknowledge is this announcement of a pandemic and infodemic simultaneously. It is quite clear that your level of skill in handling your media, your devices and what you do with them and how they fit in your life, can be seen today as a survival skill. Like finding food to eat and finding a mate to reproduce with. I mean, like that from a Darwinian perspective. In that row of key essential skills for our humanity's future is how you use your media. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And not because media are awful and dangerous and scary, or that they are fantastic, bring the world together and everything will be great. No. It's just that there is no outside of media anymore. And a third and final comment to your important question, and it's more like a comment that asks us to articulate your question with certain key concerns. The first one is be wary of all theories of all-powerful media in our concerns. The second is the inseparability of life, society, and media. And the third one, I would argue, is it's something I mentioned briefly in my presentation earlier, is that as media scholars, we've learned one thing and one thing very clearly about media and what media do in the world, which is that media amplify and accelerate what's already there. Like the media didn't create the Arab Spring. The media don't create the Black Lives Matter movement. The media doesn't, right? Media don't do that. What media did in the Arab world was they amplified and accelerated existing widespread social, cultural, and economic frustration among different strands of society, of young people and older people alike, of men and women alike, of Muslim and non-Muslim alike. And that propelled these growing and long-lasting frustrations onto the limelight and into the streets. So that is a small example of a broader point, right? Media amplify and accelerate. So whenever we are concerned about growing dependency on mobile media, on people increasingly being exposed to all kinds of information, a lot of it really, really bad information, just remember, in this context, media are amplifying and accelerating something. What is it that they're amplifying? And I'll tell you what they're amplifying. Let's say we study what people talk about outside of media, like 50 years ago. What would they talk about, at work, at the water cooler, or in the marketplace when they go shopping, or when friends talk on the phone for hours and hours on end, or when they hang out in a bar after a couple of drinks? You'd be shocked to hear what they're talking about. Most of it not particularly informed by any kind of truth or vetted information. we don't really know much about what we're talking about, generally speaking. And that's fine. What we are now seeing is that those conversations are amplified and accelerated on a global scale, and they're not matched by institutional conversations. In other words, it's not that we're all talking about something and then in the end turn to an institution and tell us, okay, give us the truth. Even though that institution, let's say journalism, is still trying to do that desperately. It's like, no, these conversations are now at the same level of hierarchy as those institutional ones. And that is the difficulty. So I would argue in conclusion about this so important point that it's not that the whole society as a whole is changing because of things. I think what we're seeing is that we are better capable of observing what the conversation society has with itself actually is. And the challenge is, how do we move forward in all of this? And I think, like I said earlier, a huge chunk here can be solved or can be addressed through thinking carefully and creatively and critically about literacy, and finding better ways to make people take responsibility for their own media use.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the response, sir.
Thank you for the question. Appreciate it.
So I have a question from Rajalakshmi. She's experiencing some connectivity issues. So I'm asking this question on behalf of her.
Thank you.
The question is, Professor, what are your thoughts on the correlation between post-truth mediatization and the role of social responsibility of media in the context of the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is such an important question, and thank you for asking it. And I hope you're still online, and so we can. So post-truth. I've talked with a lot of journalists in this last year, and they, like I said earlier in my presentation, I'm in such awe with the work that they do because they do it under impossible circumstances, right? A lot of them have lost their jobs, or at least their steady contracts, and even if they do still have their jobs, they're often not allowed in the newsroom. They're sitting home alone, trying to sort of report on things, also taking care of their families, trying not to get sick. I mean, and within that, journalism does a lot of things really, really well. I mean, journalists tell us what the World Health Organization is saying, what our local leaders are saying, and they inform us when there's a lockdown and why there's a lockdown and all those kind of things. Then they give us numbers, right? They all news organizations in the world have built resources for us to find the latest data, the latest information, and to offer help in that sense. And they told us stories. Right? How does this affect, the butcher on the corner or the marketplace or the theater where you go and see plays? So they've done a remarkable job. But as my Australian colleague Terry Flew told me in an interview I did with him a couple of weeks ago, you can find those interviews on my YouTube channel. I started a vlog where I interview academics about all of this. And Terry said, yes, journalists have been doing all of this, but it's clear that in this context, the truth is not enough. And that speaks to your question, what the relationship is between post-truth mediatization and the social responsibility of media. That media are taking responsibility, trying to debunk, like what we've just seen in the American elections, right? How hard journalists have been working to show, and not just journalists, also platforms like Twitter and Facebook, whenever Donald Trump or Joe Biden posted things that were evidently not true, labeling them with warnings, linking people to vetted resources. So there's been a lot of really good responsibility taking happening, but it's not enough. And simply telling people the truth is not enough. And the reason for that is primarily that people do not reflect on how they know what they know, right? We are not epistemologically inclined, as you will. And of course we're not. I mean, that takes an extraordinary amount of cognitive resources to constantly consider and look at yourselves like, how do I know what I know? How do I determine what is true and what is false? How do I make sense of things? And do that before you make any kind of decision in media. That's a lot to ask of an average citizen, an average person. Ideally, that's what needs to happen, but that's not going to happen. I'm not naive in that sense. So if traditionally journalism, and in this case platforms, have played the role of trying to tell people the truth as best they can, and we now know that the truth is not enough in a post-truth era. Post-truth is like fake news. It's an evocative concept, but it's also a concept that is problematic to use. So I try to stay away from it as much as possible. It also suggests that there was a truth era before all of this, and there wasn't. So, but in a time where we are all exposed to too much information to make sense of anything, let's just agree on that. And that a lot of that information is just plainly wrong. But it's very hard for any of us to make that distinction, including for journalists. If the truth in that context is not enough, something else needs to happen as well. And to be fair, I'm not sure what that is. When I advise journalism organizations or journalists on what to do, I generally end up with saying things like, well, it seems that we learn from media studies that the primary way in which people make sense of things is through other people, right? We don't believe something because we've seen it on TV or because somebody said it on Facebook. We believe it because it fits with the community that we feel part of. A famous study that was done after the previous American elections when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton. And we know that in the last months of those elections, information campaigns ran rampant, especially on Facebook. We all remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and especially conspiracy theories called Pizzagate. As you may remember, there was a theory, still very popular today among the Canon group, that Donald Trump unfortunately listens to as well, that the Democratic Party was involved in running a child pornography ring out of a pizza in Washington, D.C. It was that popular that a guy showed up at that pizza with a gun in his hand trying to free the children. And a study was done later on to identify the people that were mostly involved on Facebook in promoting these kind of messages. And they contacted those people and asked them to do an interview. And a lot of them said yes. So these interviewers sat down with these people and said, like, well, did you share this information about Pizzagate? Yeah, I did. And then they would tell them, like, well, this is plainly untrue, right? This is not happening. There's a police investigation. Nothing is happening here. And what they found is that most of these people knew it was untrue, but they didn't care. So the question is, why would you then spread that kind of false information? They said, well, it shows that I'm part of the camp that absolutely does not want Miss Clinton to become the next president. And that is in a nutshell what's going on here, right? Why doesn't truth necessarily matter to people, neither today nor 100 years ago? Is because truth always gets filtered through to belonging. Our media and our information environment is first and foremost a reflection of who we are. And so the truth in that context can never be enough to help people make sense of the world they live in. It should always come with a relationship. And I think that's the key challenge, for example, for journalism. Journalism has professionalized during the 20th century to the extent that its relationship with audiences has become one of distance. Journalism are very far away in their office buildings that we cannot enter, doing things that we cannot see, and then expecting us to just say, yeah, that's the truth. Why would anybody do that, right? they have to come down again from these faraway places and be among their communities. And that's why it's so sad that around the world, especially local journalism, is so much on the decline. And community media are so important. That's one thing we can learn from, like in my case, because I lived in Africa for such a long time, from African communities, right? That community media in Africa, especially radio, is key up to this day. And much better capable of informing people because they are part of their communities. And that's what truth needs. Truth needs community to work. And so the way forward, I do think, is social. It's about relationships. It's about community. It's about belonging, and not only by truth. Telling better truth is not going to help. I hope that.
Okay. Thank you, Professor,
for answering that concern.
It was a very wonderful session indeed.
Thank you so much.
And I invite Dr. Dinesh Babu, Head of Department of Visual Media and Communication at our campus, for the vote of thanks. Dinesh sir, please.
Thank you for the session, sir. Thank you for giving a wonderful discussion and interaction session which will enrich the idea among the students and scholars to understand their role as a media researchers to focus for future after this global pandemic. Thank you, Professor Mark Dews. This is a particular session take me personally to my post-graduation days of 2008, learning all theories from my course Mass Communications book in person and whole on behalf of faculty, students and scholars of Department of Visual Media and Communication. I take this opportunity to thank you for making this evening a fruitful and valuable. Looking forward to collaborate more to build a global communication and development among the academicians and researchers. Thank you once again for giving a valuable time for us, and thank you for your support, and thank you for the support from our director sir, who always guide us to bring out a good academical activities. And I'm thanking participants and in-house and outsiders who accept and spend their time, their valuable time to have an interaction with our eminent professor. I thank our ICTS supporting team who supports our whole activities in and outside the campus. At close, I thank one and all for making this evening wonderful and useful and knowledgeable. Thanking to everyone, and a special thanks for Mark the user for accepting my invitation to have a session at during your hectic time period. And thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege to be part of your session today, and I hope to see you again in the future.
Yeah.
Definitely. So looking forward to meeting you in person after the lockdown. If you happen
absolutely
to coming to India,
that would be my distinct pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Hari Krishnan sir.
Yes, Dinesh sir. We'll end the